From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. I'm your host, Remco Tanis.
Dan kini kami mengundang Bapak Prabowo Subianto.
This October, Indonesia will inaugurate Prabowo Subianto as its next president.
Rakyat yang memutuskan, rakyat berhak untuk mendapat pemimpin yang dikehendaki oleh rakyat Indonesia.
That's Prabowo in his victory speech on election night back in February, moving flawlessly between singing the national anthem of Indonesia to delivering a rousing hour-long speech to dancing to the beat, which brought him the votes of so much of Indonesia's young population. It was Prabowo's third try to win the presidency, and he finally got it, thanks to the support from the popular sitting president Joko Widodo, who searched for ways at the edge of the law, and some say beyond that, to secure his legacy and influence once he hands over power to Prabowo on October 20th. Leaders from all over the world have been courting the incoming Indonesian president over the past few months, and Prabowo seems to love presidenting around the world much more than Jokowi ever did. If all goes well, says Dewi Fortuna Anwar, my guest on this episode, Indonesia under Prabowo could claim a much more active role on the world stage to deal with global issues like climate change and energy security. Although, Professor Anwar says, it might not all be positive headlines coming out of Jakarta, as Prabowo is known to be quite temperamental and unpredictable and not too shy about courting controversy. Dewi Fortuna Anwar is one of Indonesia's foremost political and foreign policy experts and former advisor to the highest levels of power in Jakarta. She'll be speaking at our flagship State of Asia conference this November in Zurich. More on that later. First of all, Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, welcome to the State of Asia podcast. One thing I've noticed is that I'm seeing headlines and pieces from media, institutions, universities based in Europe, Australia, the US, again, of pessimism about Indonesia's democracy and the freedoms, the civil freedoms. Prabowo won in a landslide victory, as you mentioned. It gave him nearly 60% of the vote in an election, which is considered to have been free and mostly fair, where 80% of voters turned up, which is way more than in many elections in Europe or the US. Indonesia's democracy is only 26 years old. How strong is it, and what explains, according to you, the Western pessimism about the strength of that democracy?
Well, I have to admit that I've been part of the reform movement in the beginning, and it is not Western pessimism. It's all Indonesian political scientists and democracy activist pessimism. And the pessimism is less to do with Prabowo, but more to do with the fact that under Joko Widodo, Indonesia has suffered a serious democratic decline. So in the past 5 years of his presidency, there's an absolute concentration of power. The parties in parliament have all been, I wouldn't say colluding, but they have been co-opted. They have been part of the cabinet. On the one hand, Jokowi has been able to embrace the opposition, including by embracing Prabowo, and prevented the social fragmentation that many people feared Indonesia would suffer. Joko Widodo prevented that by reaching out to as large a coalition as possible, by including embracing Prabowo's political parties and also importing him to the cabinet. The result has been tremendous political stability. At the moment, Joko Widodo controls some 82% of the seats in parliament, with the result that parliament has not really been a functioning checks and balancer to the executive. There is very little opposition voices in the making of legislations. So this has been a serious downgrading of the Indonesian democracy. So while it is true that the democracy is functioning electorally, substantively, it has been eroding. See, Indonesia is not becoming an autocratic regime or going back into the military type of regime, like in the past. The institutions are there, the political parties are there, all of the pillars of democracy are there. But what we are seeing is that political elites coming together, making a cartel, basically, leaving very little rooms for choices. So we see this as an attempt really to deny truly competitive election. And this is so Indonesia is becoming a legalistic autocracy, probably, But this is not wrong democratically, because political parties make coalitions, there's no guns being used there. And the elites make the decisions based on their own vested interests. But the result is that this collusion between the executive body and the legislative body, and also interference in the judiciary. This is a real serious issue for Indonesian democratic consolidation.
Prabowo Subianto has been elected in a landslide with over 60% of the votes. It seems like his controversial past has all faded from collective memory. He has, of course, a history as a general in the New Order regime under authoritarian President Suharto, who ruled Indonesia until 1998 and at one point was Prabowo's father-in-law even. Prabowo is being held responsible for bloody crackdowns in that time on critics of Suharto, including fatalities and disappearances. Like I said, that seems to have faded from much of the collective memory. And also world leaders from China, Japan, Australia, the US, Europe, they were all very quick to congratulate him on his election victory and invite him to come over. What happened there? What explains this?
Well, clearly, Prabowo has been able to reinvent himself. He has paid his due. He has been dismissed from the military. He has lived in self-imposed exile overseas. And then he's come back. And clearly, there was still some reluctance to accept him because he failed 3 times. When Prabowo himself ran for president twice against Joko Widodo in 2014, he lost. But he gained quite a respectable number of votes, but he lost. And then in 2019, he also got a respectable vote, but then he still lost. So that means that for those who voted for him, some 48% of the public, his past record clearly was not that significant anymore. After all, he was never put on trial. He was just dismissed by the military ethics, and he was never really declared guilty by a court of law or even by a military court. But then he changed tactic. He toned down his rhetoric, and Jokowi embraced him, and he was willing to be embraced. In the government, he was considered to be quite an effective member of the cabinet. He was regarded one of the best ministers of defense because he knows his work, and he is able to function in international forums, which is not always the case for many Indonesian military leaders. And the most important game changer for him is the fact that he has put himself as a successor of Jokowi, someone who is committed to continuing Jokowi's legacy, particularly in the economic development, which is where Jokowi is shining in particular. Jokowi continues to enjoy a very high popular rating because of his social economic policy. And Jokowi has given his full backing and endorsement, and also pairing Prabowo with Jokowi's son. So I think that really tipped the balance, that the Jokowi effect is a very important factor that make it possible for Prabowo to win.
If Prabowo has been successful in reinventing himself and in that way finally on his third try win the presidency, how confident are you that he will remain this reinvented version of himself once he has been inaugurated?
I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt because, Prabowo is a very complex person. His background is extremely cosmopolitan. He's lived in many countries, including in Switzerland, and has been educated overseas in Europe, in the United States, established family. But unlike his relatives, he made his choice to have a career in the military and then in politics and business. So there are many faces of Prabowo. So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Also bearing the fact that we expected so much from Joko Widodo as a product of the reform era, someone who did not come from the old established elite family, who did not have any military or bureaucratic or political party's background. Most of us, including myself, expected him to be someone who will not only be good for the economy, but also be good for Indonesian democratic consolidation. But apparently, that's a disappointment that has not been the case.
You mentioned how Prabowo has a much more cosmopolitan upbringing compared to Widodo. He was born into Indonesia's elite, but then grew up in Kuala Lumpur, London, Zurich. As president-elect, he this year visited China and Japan, so even before actually becoming president. Current President Widodo never really seemed to like presidenting around the world. He famously never attended the UN General Assembly meeting in New York. With the President Prabowo, should we prepare for a bigger presence of Indonesia on the world stage? And what would that look like? What would Prabowo put forward as priorities Indonesia has in the world?
In fact, between April and August, Prabowo has visited 12 countries. You're right that China and Japan, quite strangely, I would say, received Prabowo at the highest level, even before he was officially declared the winner. So that is unusual. That probably shows you the eagerness of both countries to embrace Prabowo. And among others, probably because Prabowo has been quite critical of China in the past. After all, the Indonesian army tended to see China in the past as the main threat to regional security. And in fact, he was quite critical of Joko Widodo, of the large-scale opening of Indonesian natural resources and strategic projects to China's investment. Maybe China wanted to ensure that we'll have goodwill, and therefore being the first to invite him, despite the fact that he was not yet officially declared president. And then, interestingly, he visited Japan straight afterward. Japan is also another major player in the Indonesian economy, but at the same time, it's also seen as part of the important US alignment. So, do we expect to see Prabowo or Indonesia having a larger footprint? At least Prabowo himself, will be much more visible. As I said, he's only visited 12 countries. He's clearly quite eager to play the high-level diplomacy. This could be good or this could be bad. It could be good because that means that when a president takes personal interest on an issue, that issue becomes top priority. So we can imagine that, the foreign ministry will be there to support him. But as now, the foreign policy is not just about international relations, it's about economics, it's about social, it's about climate change. So we expect Prabowo to pay an interest also on issues that are of current global concerns, like energy security, food security. And in fact, he talks a lot about that. He doesn't just talk about traditional security. He's very keen. In his visit to Russia, apparently he talked a lot about energy security and food security. With China, he also talked about economic issues. So Prabowo himself will be a much more hands-on foreign policy president in comparison to Joko Widodo. And then how this will play out and how Indonesia itself will be regarded or will be active. I think that depends very much. If everything goes well, maybe Indonesia will return to its former quite active globally. Under President SBY, President Yudhoyono, he was also very active. He took a lot of leadership role at the global stage. He was very active on climate change, very active on open government, for example. So he was recognized as both a globalist and a regionalist president. He also made a lot of headlines in regional fora. But there is also a risk. Prabowo is known to be quite temperamental and could be quite unpredictable. So Indonesia could make headlines not just positively, but could also be some raised eyebrows on issues that probably might be quite out of the box.
Do you have any idea what kind of issues might push his buttons?
One of the issues in which he might lose his temper could be during a press conference, where there'll be a lot of journalists who will be eager to talk about his past record. During his visit to Australia, now that Indonesia has elevated its defense agreement with Australia, both governments are very keen to bring Indonesia closer. But Australian media, they are quite keen to focus on a number of sensitive issues like human rights in the past, Prabowo's past human rights record, and also the current problems in Papua, for example. That could trigger some forthright response from him. Also, he tends to be very forthright when it comes to Europe, because Prabowo gets very angry when European countries lecture developing countries on issues of human rights, environment, and so on, because when they say, you're talking to us about this now, you are former colonial countries, exploited our natural resources, cut down our forests and subjected our people to colonial exploitation. Not many Indonesian presidents after Sukarno was that frank. So to a certain extent, Prabowo reminds us of President Sukarno with his very fiery anti-colonial and anti-imperialistic rhetorics, and not being too Javanese, put it that way. Not too shy in being abrasive or assertive or to disagree. Prabowo is not too shy about quoting controversy or calling a spade more than a spade sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. I've read a lot about how Prabowo always loved poking fun at Europe, and he's very critical of the European Union. It doesn't probably also help that Europe has taken Indonesia to court over the ban on nickel exports. That Europe keeps demanding Indonesia's palm oil industry becomes more sustainable, which is still standing in the way of a free trade agreement between Indonesia and the EU. Do you think Prabowo maybe will see, well, there might be some practicalities to tone it down a little bit on Europe because it would be good economically or otherwise to get a bit closer? Or will he just continue to have a little bit of fun with it, with criticizing Europe?
Well, Prabowo personally is having fun with criticizing Europe, but Indonesia's policy regarding palm oil, regarding downstreaming nickel, it's not Prabowo's policy. That's Jokowi's policy also, and also SBY's policy, the desire to have greater value added for our natural resources. That's been the ambition of successive Indonesian government, that we do not want to continue to have this Dutch East India type of economic relationship with the developed countries where natural resources are taken out of our land and processed, and then the outsiders enjoy, the value added. So regardless of who is going to become leaders in Indonesia, this is a national policy. There is a tendency to look at Europe policy regarding palm oil is less concerned about environment, it's more about protecting its own cooking oils industry. And about the nickel one, so why should Indonesia process its own nickel? Indonesia is engaged in protectionist policies for its own national interest. The EU has been carrying out a lot of protectionist policies for their own reasons as well. But I believe that Indonesia needs Europe, and Europe also needs Indonesia and the Indo-Pacific region. There are so many issues that we need to consider, the issues of international peace and security, global commons, where all regions have to come together. And it would be a shame if the two regions will be kept apart because of some, knotty issues like palm oil or nickel.
Just, I think it was last year that Indonesia did agree on a free trade agreement with Switzerland. Is Switzerland just less picky towards Indonesia, just not whining so much as compared to the EU?
Well, Switzerland is not part of the EU. So negotiating at a bilateral level is always much easier, because then you just only deal with the two countries' particular concerns. Indonesia has signed a lot of FTAs with various countries at bilateral level, as well as ASEAN, of course, but signing anything with EU is going to be a headache. Just filling a form under EU, even if just to apply for something quite simple, but if it is under EU, then it's just a bureaucratic nightmare sometimes.
You've attended the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore every year since its founding 21 years ago. It's the annual gathering in Singapore of generals and other military and national security leaders and experts from around the world. At this year's event, held in June, you were quoted as saying you're worried about the US-China relationship and its twists and turns that could leave the rest of the region trampled. Could you explain a little bit, what do you mean? What risks do you see of the region being trampled in this US-China dynamic?
Last year, when the US Secretary of Defense, still the same person, Lloyd Austin, did not get to meet with his Chinese counterpart. And the situation was really, really quite tense, because it was also after the balloon incident, where the Chinese balloon flew over mainland United States. The rhetorics on the ground, the naming of name, was very much more explicit. This year, the situation is much better. The two defense ministers actually met. They were being not as pontificating against each other as before. They were trying to find common ground. So my question to the US Secretary of Defense was that, for the region, we are equally worried when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. But when elephants make love, grass also gets trampled. So, so while we will see worsening tension between the US and China, if it's going to tip to the other side, to open conflict, it is going to be extremely dangerous for peace and stability as a whole. And our prosperity depends very much on trade, free navigation, and shipping, and air flights, and so on. And if there is any shooting in the Taiwan Strait, incident in the South China Sea, all of those is going to be disrupted. So between peace, stability, and prosperity is just two sides of the same coin. And Southeast Asia is really very much part of that economic ecosystem. But a bit of competition between the major powers is good for us, because it means that we have choices, because all of these countries come to us offering us various types of financial incentives, investments, choices, technologies, whether it is buying simple technologies or even military hardware. The more choices, the better for the buyers. If there is going to be another development going in another direction, for example, Beijing and Washington getting too friendly with each other, getting into a convergence or a G2, that would also squeeze the living space for the medium and small countries, because then we would not have choice. The last thing we want is a cartel between the major powers, dividing the spoil, put it that way. Maybe the US can say, okay, China, you can have this part of South China Sea, and we'll concentrate somewhere else. That is also bad news for us.
Do you think President Prabowo would prefer to deal with a President Harris or a President Trump come January?
Well, I think that is a very politically incorrect question to answer. No, we will have to work with the United States of America, regardless of who is president. Both are known quantities. So I think that the region will have to grit its teeth, regardless who becomes president. But we just hope that whoever becomes president will have a more outward orientation, not simply inward looking. For example, just America first and not too concerned about the rest of the world.
How's that with ASEAN then? You mentioned the region a few times, but ASEAN is, of course, a very diverse organization. If you look at its member states, from economically diverse to the political systems, but also in the relationships the individual members have, for example, with China, where you see the Philippines and China experiencing quite significant tensions in the past few months. On the other hand, you have countries like Thailand and Cambodia that feel a lot more comfortable dealing with Beijing and being a lot closer to Beijing. Is there a role for ASEAN or for Indonesia in ASEAN in determining the relationships with the US, with China, and with others?
ASEAN does not have a common foreign and security policy, unlike the EU. So when it comes to foreign policy, each ASEAN country has its own dynamics. ASEAN is a very diverse region. Southeast Asia is very diverse. So that is the reason why there will always be a limit to ASEAN unity. ASEAN has never aimed to become a federation or a union like Europe, having a supranational organization with central bureaucracy and determining the policies of different countries. It will be a non-starter for ASEAN. The reality is that we try to develop common norms, and that has worked very well. Like the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, that the disputes will be settled peacefully, and that no countries should use force to settle disputes. Despite the fact that this is a non-binding treaty, in the sense there's no enforcement mechanism, it has worked. ASEAN countries have not gone to war against each other. Southeast Asian region has been of relative peace if you compare it to many other regions, or if you compare it to the earlier period prior to the existence of ASEAN. But the diversity is a reality, and we can look at this as in positively, not just negatively. Some countries have greater relations, closer relations to the United States. We can use that closeness to benefit ASEAN as a whole. Some countries are closer to China. We can also use that closeness to also benefit ASEAN, because ASEAN regards both China and the United States being equally important. Prabowo has said many times that he regards both the United States and China as being extremely important, that they're two great civilizations that have contributed much to the world. As great powers, they have great responsibility also to ensure that the region remains stable.
Widodo is leaving office in October with record high approval ratings. I mean, he has delivered better infrastructure, healthcare, poverty alleviation for many Indonesians. And one of his themes or policy agendas, which Prabowo has stated he will continue, was to build a golden Indonesia by 2045, which is 100 years since the country's proclamation of independence. What is this golden Indonesia both envision, and what needs to be done to achieve that by 2045, which is already in 20 years?
Well, a golden Indonesia would see Indonesia as becoming a modern country, high income, achieving not just political stability, not just wealth, but also the development of resilient human capital, and a country that is respected outside of its own borders. The key to that is, if there's one thing that Indonesia must do, it has to escape the middle income trap. If Indonesia is serious about transforming this period to become, a golden Indonesia, we need to create a good economic system where newly educated students, young people will get good jobs. And that means, creating the economic system where it will be able to absorb new employment cohorts. At the moment, the informal sector is still the largest employer of Indonesian workers, while the formal sector actually is taking less employees. This means that Indonesia is not really able to scale up the economic ladder yet. And clearly, this is a vicious circle. This is about qualifications, education, training, the ability to enter the new economy and this new digital era, and then to be not just users of new technology, but also be part of the not just consumers, but also producers of the various new technologies. And this is a real challenge for Indonesia, because if you look at all those countries that have become modern countries, are not because they're rich in oil and minerals and gold, but it's because they have very good human capital. In the region, Singapore is the most developed, and Singapore doesn't have much natural resources. Japan doesn't have much natural resources. South Korea doesn't have much natural resources. So Indonesia needs to go in that stream. So this is education, education, and education. And that is, I think, the policy of Prabowo government is going to focus very much on improving the human quality, including by providing good nutrition for the students. Under our constitution, 20% of the national budget is dedicated for education. But it will take time, it's not going to happen overnight.
Are you optimistic about the next 5 years?
I'm optimistic in the next 20 years. The next 5 years, we have a lot of challenges because of what is happening outside, because Indonesia is so plugged into the international system. So there are a lot of concerns. So the concern is about the China risk, not of US-China conflict in terms of war, but if China's economy goes down for whatever reasons, that's going to impact directly on Indonesia's economy, because China is a major market for Indonesian products. So if there is a lessening of demand, that will affect us as well. So it's very systemic. If the international environment is not healthy, that's going to affect us as well. So let's hope that the various conflicts will end soon, that the market will be much more stable, and then we can continue to work in a more predictable environment.
Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, thank you very much for your time, and we look very much forward to welcome you as a speaker to our State of Asia conference here in Zurich on November 6th and 7th.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Thank you.
It'll only be a few weeks after the inauguration, right? Are you going to attend the inauguration of Prabowo?
Well, I'll watch it on TV, I think.
Oh, okay. Good. Well, thank you very much once again for your time, and we look forward to meeting you in Zurich in November.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Here in the room are my colleagues Serena Jung and Nico Lussinger to talk a bit about what we heard from Dewi Fortuna Anwar. I must say I've never heard someone so eloquently describe the great power competition and how some discord between two great powers, China and the US, how some discord is actually good for others, but how too much strife or even too much love between the two could work out quite negatively and is not the preferred choice at this moment. Serena, what you make of the way she sees that?
Obviously, I think we all love the elephant saying about fight and love. And I think it's the argument that we've heard before, especially from Southeast Asia, that there's actually more room for the smaller countries in the competition than in an agreement or in a complete conflict. It's the first time also I realize these countries have a big priority on their domestic development. And I think it wasn't that clear to me so far that they don't care what the political system in China is or the US. These are markets and these are opportunities for development, and their foreign policy is part of their domestic policy.
Nico, what stood out for you?
The one thing that I kept coming back to here is that I kept being reminded of India. And I want to be a bit careful here because I'm aware how radically different those two countries are. I'm not saying there's comparable or don't want to throw them in the same bucket necessarily, but just a few things that came up that I think relate to India in a way. One is a democratic system that has in some ways been weakened. So where a leader has taken over who has been able to solidify political support and in a way stabilize the system, but at the expense of democratic plurality. There was also, I think, some echoes of things that Alicia Garcia Herrero told me a few episodes ago when we talked about the Indian versus the Chinese economy, with regards to how Indonesia and its president-elect sort of respond to Europe. Alicia then said, the European Union should get off its high horse, make a free trade agreement with India and not insist on all the green transition things it insists on. And the argument, which I felt is very powerful and I think shown through here as well, is that if you're the EU and you're an association of rich countries, you can try to impose your rules on a poor country through a free trade agreement. But the thing is that they're not going to follow through these rules unless you give them the ability to become richer, right? And so basically sort of holding off on any sort of trade advantages is not really the way to go. The huge emphasis on education, I think, is something that we keep hearing about India as well, right? So if India really wants to develop its economy, it has to focus on education. David said the same about Indonesia. So I think in a way, again, I'm not saying the countries are necessarily similar or comparable, but at the very least, sort of, I think sort of the lens that we, as Asian Society Switzerland, put on them seem to mean that we're looking at them in somewhat similar ways. And I thought that was interesting.
I like how she gives Prabowo the benefit of the doubt. Just going back to that democratic decline, she clearly lays at the feet of Jokowi as being responsible for that. You would really expect, given their pasts, all three of these people, Jokowi coming not from the elites, Prabowo who was clearly on the opposite side of the Indonesian history and democracy shaping in the late 90s than Dewi is and was. Yet now she says, well, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Our democratic institutions are still standing.
I was also surprised by this. Also, given Jokowi's perception also abroad, like he has a legacy, he built up so much, he developed the country so much economically, and then that also goes counter to my point before, that development is not everything to the people.
Now, after listening to this conversation, I'm very curious to see, how Indonesia will behave on the international stage under President Prabowo. There's obviously certain danger, if you have a loose cannon as a president, then, he gets let loose on the international stage. But I think actually the upside here might be quite big at a time when I think Asian countries are becoming more assertive, more influential on the international stage. They have a president who's cosmopolitan, who's grown up in many different places around the world, who probably has a good international network and who also wants to play that role. And I think that could just be very interesting, right? It could just be that Prabowo will become a fixture, in international gatherings and fora in a way that his predecessor certainly wasn't. And I think that could actually have an effect.
Yeah, and the fact that she says, well, he is really focused on and has already spoken on global issues like climate change, like food security, like energy security. So going way broader than maybe how we tend to think in international relations, just the military toe-to-toe and building up of navies and things like that. She said, no, it might be a lot more about these other global issues. And the same when she mentioned the China risk. It wasn't even about a war in the South China Sea or around Taiwan. She says, no, it's the China risk for us is the risk that the Chinese economy isn't recovering. That's all for this episode. As mentioned, Dewi Fortuna Anwar will be in Zurich to speak at our State of Asia conference on November 7th. For a full speaker lineup and more information on how to attend, a link is in the show notes. That's where you'll also find links to details on all our upcoming events, how to become a member of Asia Society Switzerland, and about the other ways to support us. The guest on our next episode of the podcast, out in 2 weeks, will also speak at our conference in November. It's Qing Wang, until recently Europe correspondent for Shanghai-based Jiamian News, and since 2019, host of the immensely popular Chinese podcast, The Weirdo. It promises to be special. Follow State of Asia in your favorite podcast app so you won't miss a thing. My name is Remco Tanis. Thanks for listening.